So the National Security Advisor is in Washington for follow-up talks on the joint fact sheet, outlining details of trade and security agreements between the two countries. For more on this, we're joined today by Matthew David Jenkins, an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at Gyeongsang National University. Professor Jenkins, thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So the National Security Advisor Ri Sung-rak said he would discuss concluding a separate agreement with Washington to build nuclear-powered submarines. How do you think the talks will play out?
Yeah, so under existing agreements, the 123 agreement, Korea is not allowed to use nuclear fuel for military purposes. So they're going to have to figure out a way to make an agreement that allows Korea to do that. I expect that the details will be pretty technical, highly technical, and not something that's going to be any major announcements coming soon. But I think that a bigger issue underlying this, though, is where they're going to build the submarine. Korea is going on the assumption that it's going to be built in Korea. The United States is going on the assumption that it's going to be built in the United States, right, in the Philadelphia shipyard. So I think that will be another sticking point that it would be great to see if they can move forward on that to figure out where it's actually going to be built. So.
Right, and as part of a joint venture aimed at strengthening supply chain ties between Seoul and Washington, Korea's Zinc will build a $7 billion plant in the United States, to produce key metals and minerals. And many analysts see this as a U.S. effort to sort of form critical mineral partnerships that are not dependent on China. Could this also be on the agenda when we is in Washington, and what's your take on this?
Yeah, I actually think this is less about the decoupling strategy, like trying to move away from the Chinese supply chain networks. I think this is, from the U.S. perspective, it's more about kind of a way of pursuing industrial policy domestically, right, to show that America is going to increase its manufacturing sector, right, and to actually start to build things again. That's a part of that supply chain, right, a part of that process. So that's kind of how I see it from the United States perspective. Like, for comparison, the United States also concluded an agreement with Japan, which is a much more extensive agreement that covers a variety of rare earth minerals, and that's sort of more of a better example of that. So I think from the U.S. perspective, yeah, it's more about domestic policy. And from the Korean perspective, it's about showing compliance, right? Showing almost like an over-compliance, right? In order to, sort of shore up its relationship with the United States. Perhaps from Korea's perspective, it could use this as leverage in further negotiations for different topics, such as the topic like the submarine issue there, the nuclear fuel agreement. And so that's kind of how I would see it from Korea's perspective, rather than seeing it. I mean, certainly it is going to contribute to the U.S.'s strategic move away from the Chinese supply chain, but I see it as more of a limited diplomatic move from Korea's perspective and a more of a domestic policy move from the United States perspective.
I see. And regarding North Korea, the Trump administration repeatedly said, it hopes to resume face-to-face diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. And we is seeking to discuss this issue while he's in Washington. What are your thoughts on the possibility of talks between Pyongyang and Washington?
Yeah, I would say not a huge chance of that happening right at the moment. It certainly is possible. Both the United States and Pyongyang want some kind of process. They would love to have to show that they are engaging and making progress on the issue. From the U.S. perspective, right, they want to make progress on the denuclearization issue. From the North Korea perspective, they want recognition, improve their diplomatic status internationally. But I just don't see a great need right now. North Korea has, since 2018, right? In 2018, that was a much different situation. Denuclearization was still was more potential for that. And right now, North Korea has pretty much abandoned that, and having nuclear weapons is a fundamental part of the regime's legitimacy. And so I think the two are inseparable. And so I don't see much like progress in that respect, even though formally, right, the United States that's the main reason to have dialogue with North Korea, right, is to get nuclear weapons out of the peninsula. So given that's a pretty big gap, right? And I don't see that, I don't see much room for progress. Maybe there might be some superficial sort of like announcement of working level talk, like lower level meetings and things like this, just to show that we haven't forgotten about this issue, right? But I don't see much happening. From Korea's perspective, I would think that this is, Korea doesn't want to be left out, right? They were kind of like more of a passive partner in the 2018 talks, and they were sort of forced to accept whatever came out of those meetings. And so I would hope that Mr. Lee would use this as an opportunity to sort of shape the agenda and make sure that Korea is at least included in those whatever discussions happen, that it shapes it some way.
Right, and the Korean government also said that it will focus on resuming dialogue with North Korea next year. What's your take on the prospects for inter-Korean talks?
Yeah, so similar situation here, except that, Korea kind of needs these talks, or, in a sense, right? North Korea doesn't really need them as much. I mean, obviously, diplomacy with South Korea is important, but North Korea has moved, closer to Russia, closer to China. Again, as I said earlier, abandoned the idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons, and so it's unclear what North Korea has to gain from engaging with South Korea in a real, like, substantive way. On the other side, South Korea would certainly love to make some progress in bridging the gap between the two countries, particularly in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, right? And North Korea deploying troops, and these kinds of issues are, right, kind of reaching not a boiling point, but certainly creating tension. And so it would love to relieve that tension. But I would say that, North Korea is probably like, I don't really care. I'm not so interested, right? So again, similar thing, right? There might be symbolic, like, low-level talks, but I would be pretty surprised if they announce, like, major, like, high-level summits at this point.
Right, right. I guess we'll have to see how that goes. All right, Professor Jenkins, thank you so much for your insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.